The final speaker in this session is going to be Mike Dorr, and he's going to be talking about vegetarians and meat eaters, testing relative performance in a precognitive Ganzfeld remote viewing task. So over to Mike, and Mike's also opting for a 25-minute talk.
Thanks, Christine. And thank you to the organisers for giving me the opportunity to talk, because I'm having a blast these few days, so it's really great. So I'm going to be talking about the third study in my PhD thesis, and this is, as it says, a Ganzfeld experiment to test differences between vegetarians and meat eaters. So what I'm going to try and do is to try and race through the first few slides, so there's a bit more time to speak, to kind of slow down at the end rather than the other way around. So hopefully I'll keep to that plan. So first, some quick key terms. So the focus of this study was on vegetarianism, but I did test for other measures. And in my PhD as a whole, I'm also looking at fasting as well as vegetarianism. So just a quick definition of that. So fasting, I'm defining that as voluntary, time-limited abstention from some or all food and sometimes liquids. And in terms of the vegetarianism, so the first term is vegan. So a vegan diet is no consumption of animal products. Actually, a lot of vegans will say that a vegan philosophy is no use of animal products in anything, so in clothing and so on. But in this, I'm focusing specifically on a vegan diet or a plant-based diet. The term vegetarian, I'm interpreting to mean no consumption of meat, but consumption of dairy and or eggs. So a formal definition of vegetarian actually includes veganism, but that can get very confusing. So actually, in terms of the slides, I'm going to use this rather ugly formulation, VEG*AN, and that means vegan and vegetarian. So the person who invented the word vegan is actually a contraction of the word vegetarian. Intentionally, so that's actually makes it quite hard when you're trying to abbreviate. So that's what I had no idea how to pronounce that third word, but anyway, that's what it looked like on the slides. So first of all, some context. So in lots of spiritual and religious traditions, there are practices of fasting and vegetarianism right back to shamanism, probably the oldest and most widespread spiritual practice there is. Certainly fasting is ubiquitous to all practices in shamanism, but vegetarianism too is practiced as well in order to kind of get into a certain trance state. They're widespread in the Indian yogic traditions, particularly Hinduism, Buddhism and Jainism, where they're also sometimes associated with siddhis or supernormal powers. In the ancient Greek religion, again, fasting and vegetarianism is very widespread. And again, this guy is Apollonius of Tyana, and he was followed essentially a vegan diet, and he was said to be able to levitate and read minds and so on. And he attributed that to what he called his light and clear diet. And fasting is also fundamental, really, in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam. Vegetarianism less so, although some adherents will practice that as well. And then leaping right forward to kind of more recent times, in spiritualism, you had this kind of phenomena of what were called fasting girls, really fasting girls and fasting women, and these were women who fasted for quite exceptional lengths of time, sometimes years, sometimes decades, and also were said to display elements of psi. In theosophy, which was kind of put forward as the philosophical basis of spiritualism, the founders, Helena Blavatsky and Annie Besant, both recommended vegetarianism to promote kind of what they called occult powers. You've got Rudolf Steiner, who promoted fasting and vegetarianism for spiritual development, and some of which might seem a bit like, this is his book about out-of-body experiences or seeking astral planes, although I don't think he called them that. You've got Edgar Cayce, who in a lot of his readings advocated fasting and vegetarianism, and Hereward Carrington, who was a psychical researcher, advocated both fasting and vegetarianism for spiritual development and also for developing psychic powers as well. And more recently, you have books like out-of-body experiencing books that recommend vegetarianism, this book, Spiritual Nutrition, Gabriel Cousins. Even in the Celestine Prophecy that I started reading recently, there's a mention about cutting out meat in order to foster kind of spiritual powers and psychic powers and so on. And you get books like this, Eating in the Light, which is making the switch to veganism on your spiritual path. So there's all this kind of literature that's out there, but so far as I can find, very little or next to no empirical research, which is where I came in. Also, by the way, most of that literature is all about kind of developing spirituality or developing psychic development. But you also get this concept of spiritual emergency. So this is when people have a kind of traumatic spiritual awakening. Maybe it's very sudden and it's very disturbing because suddenly they're kind of wide open and it's very unpleasant or it can be unpleasant. And people who kind of support people in this kind of crisis situation, they often, like the people here, Christina and Stanislav Grof, they advise switching from a vegetarian diet to eating meat and dairy in order to kind of have a grounding influence. And this is really widespread in this kind of community. But as far as I know, there is no kind of empirical research to back that up, except perhaps what works in practice. So that brings me on to what my PhD program is about. So I've conducted 3 studies now. So the first was interviews with professional psychics or Psi adepts. The second was a survey of fasters and vegetarians and vegans. And the third that I'll be focusing on is this experiment. And so it's great that in the 2020 PA conference, I talked about the interview study. In the 2021, I talked about the survey study. And this year, I'm talking about the experiment study. So it seems kind of neat to me. So the Psi Adept study, this was really interviewing professional psychics really to understand how they used fasting and vegetarianism to support their work. So all these 7 psychics were they all fast. I think most of them fasted. They were all vegetarian or vegan, and they all talked about how this was important in their practice. But it was what the study was important for, really, was to understand the phenomenology of that, was to understand why they thought it was important, but also to glean kind of other insights, like they didn't just think fasting and vegetarianism was important, but also the use of whole foods, supplements, avoiding alcohol and things like that. So then I moved on from that to a kind of more general survey, so people who weren't particularly psychic. So a survey both of vegetarian and vegans, where I had over 800 participants, and also a survey of people who engage in fasting. That was 154 participants. I found these people on Facebook groups that are focused on fasting and vegetarianism. And out of that sample, I found a highly significant relationship between those who fast and those who didn't, and anomalous experiences. People who fasted for longer had reported more anomalous experiences. People who ate less meat and dairy reported more anomalous experiences. People who followed a whole food diet reported more anomalous experiences, as did those who avoided alcohol. And both of those studies you can see more on YouTube, I think, both of them shortly. So we come on to this study. How am I doing? Yes, okay. So this study is an experiment study. It uses the Ganzfeld protocol, looking at precognitive remote viewing. So this is really a replication that was conducted by my supervisors, Chris Rowe and Callum Cooper, and possibly another author, I can't remember. But so it's really a replication of the experiment they did. But the idea is to repeat it, but now to look at vegetarianism and meat eating. So I recruited 40 participants. There was no particular selection criteria beyond diet, although all the participants were kind of open to the possibility of Psi. Otherwise, they really probably wouldn't have been interested in taking part. And there was a quasi-experimental design. So 20 of my participants were either vegetarian or vegan. Actually, there were 15 vegans and 5 vegetarians, and 20 of my participants ate meat. And the study was pre-registered with the Kirster Parapsychology Unit. So in terms of demographics, the two groups were pretty similar, actually, in terms of just about all demographics, really. I'm not going to dwell on that, but just to say that there wasn't really a substantial difference in those terms. And now, in terms of the procedure, now I know many people will be familiar with how the Ganzfeld works, but this is a precognitive study as well, which is perhaps less common, or it has been in the past. So I'm going to go through exactly how I did this experiment. I'm actually going to go through it twice, so once kind of quickly, but the other taking a little bit more time. So first of all, I told participants that they were going to see a photo of a physical location in the future. However, that location is unknown until after the session is complete, so hence the precognition. Then the participant enters this sleepy, relaxed state that they get from being immersed in the Ganzfeld, and they're in that state for 30 minutes. And whilst they're in that state, the participant is reporting any images or feelings or thoughts that come to mind, and I'm with them in that room, in that physical room, writing down everything they say, basically, on a piece of paper. And then after that session, a location, one of these physical locations is selected at random from a pool of 20 images. And then the participant views that location, so that's the kind of the future event that they're looking at. And then the accuracy of that report, or the mentation, that's judged by an independent person. And then obviously do the analysis to test whether the result is just explainable by chance, or whether perhaps it's due to precognition. So just to kind of go through that, so this is one of my participants in the Ganzfeld. It's kind of they're getting a kind of uniform red glow through the kind of ping pong balls. She's wearing a sleep mask where white noise is being transmitted into her ears, and she's reclining in a comfortable position, which is all about inducing this kind of sleepy, relaxed state. And there's me writing down everything she's saying. So perhaps she's saying, I'm seeing a tower, maybe a vehicle. And then after the session, there's the pool of 5 sets of 4 locations. So there's 20 locations that were pre-selected. So these images are taken from Google Earth. And they were taken so that, as far as possible, the images would be as different as possible from each other. And there's a random selection using random.org. And to select one of those 5 sets of 4 locations, so we have our target set. And then out of that target set, one of those, again, is randomly selected to be the target. So in this instance, that's our target image and target location. And then the report, the mentation, so in this case I see a tower, maybe a vehicle, that's sent to the independent judge. And what is also sent to the independent judge is they're told which pool it's coming from. So they know that the target is one of those 4, but they don't know which one, obviously. And they judge really to see which one the mentation best matches. And what they do is they set a score, so a similarity score between 0 and 100. So depending on how similar. So in this instance, the one that they thought was most similar was the one that, well, this is seeing a tower and maybe a vehicle. So that's given a similarity score of 86 out of 100. And then the others are kind of lower scores. So the fact that first one, it's a hit. So we're going to use all of that data really in terms of the analysis, which is why I'm kind of going through it slowly, just to sort of so that you understand the results when I show them. These, by the way, weren't the actual locations. I didn't use these locations in the experiment. They're just kind of examples for the presentation. So this is just an illustrative example. So because there are 4 possible options, basically, if there's nothing going on, if there's no precognition, just by chance, you'd expect 25% hit rate. So that hopefully gives some context for the results that follow. So there are various controls for fraud and bias that I implemented. So first, it's a precognitive design. So the fact that it's a precognitive design means that the location isn't actually selected until after the session. So it's impossible for the participant or me actually to cheat, if you like, which is not actually necessarily the case in a telepathic design, as Helani was talking about in her study. You know, it is feasible that people can cheat, even if it's unlikely. But with a precognitive design, it's very easy to ensure that that can't happen. Another way is by when the mentation, in other words, the report the participant had given, I took a photograph of that and emailed it to Chris and Cal, my supervisors, and I did that before the location is selected. So if anyone, so I can actually prove that the mentation hasn't actually been altered kind of after the event to make it, to get more hits or something. The random number was generated by a third person, so it's generated by Ewan McLean, who's a fellow PhD student at Northampton, and he didn't see the mentation, so there's no way that he can be kind of making sure that the numbers, the location selected is, so there's no funny business going on there. And finally, there's independent judging by Phil Kinnersley, who's another fellow PhD student, so she obviously didn't know which the target was, so these are all kind of steps, and I have to thank the Jim Kennedy, particularly the Kirsten Parapsychology Unit and Caroline, for their suggestions to kind of help make this even more robust than it was in the initial design. Right, so what I'm going to do, before I present the kind of statistical results, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of what Chris called my greatest hits. And by the way, I mean, I just feel it was great actually doing this experiment myself, sitting in, because I kind of felt like I was in the presence of psi, and it was really kind of a really nice thing to do, and that's something that I didn't really expect. I mean, I'd read about Ganzfeld studies before, but actually experiencing someone apparently experiencing psi was quite a magical thing to be in the presence of. So one of my participants came up with this. This is not the whole script, but this is kind of edited highlights, if you like. So she said, I can see a pink flower, millipede, aquatic spindly bits, some kind of life form, a tuft of grass or a sea anemone, lavender or wheat blowing in the breeze. It looks purple, swirling like vortex. Could be millions of little fish swirling around. Fish shapes, angelfish, arrow-shaped, rushing water over edge of stony surface, looking into water, very clear. Pink flower, different kind from before, swirling again, water rushing into a whirlpool, like a beach, quite bright, turquoise sea, long sandy beach, something swimming along, aquatic thing may be most important. And that was the target, which was the Great Barrier Reef, which I have to say blew us all away, really. And just so that you know, it wasn't just me and the participant thinking this was pretty dramatic, the independent judge, who had no idea that that was the target, also ranked this number 1. So they ranked it as a hit. Second example, someone else said, another participant said, I can see a corridor, it's dark, it's getting darker, there's no end to the corridor, I can't see a door, feels as if I'm underground somewhere. Now it's gone really dark, there's a draft, I can feel a draft, I can see stars now, I can't tell if I'm in the corridor or up in the sky somewhere. There's no ground under my feet, yet I'm still walking, I can see the stars again, I'm rocking a bit, there's movement, something's making me rock. The stars seem to be in front of me, not above me. It seems as if I'm in a narrow corridor. It reminded me of the catacombs in Rome. And then when the target was selected, it was New York Central Underground Railway Station. Again, which was marked by the judge as a hit. And actually, that is more or less the whole of what she said. So, in terms of the statistical results, first of all, the hit rates. So remember, there's a 25% chance of someone getting a hit. So you'd expect by chance there to be 25%. So these were the results. So for all my participants together, there were 11 hits out of 40, which was 28%. So it's more than 25%, but not by much. So unsurprisingly, that wasn't a significant result. But looking at just the meat eaters, well, they got 3 hits out of 20, so they got 15%. So that was clearly lower than 25%, but again, that wasn't a significant result, possibly due to the small sample. My vegetarians and vegans as a group, they got 40%, so they got a hit rate of 40%. Again, not significant. If we look at the vegans alone, there were 15 vegans out of the 20 vegetarians and vegans, and they got a hit rate of 47%. Again, not significant because quite a small sample, but hopefully kind of interesting, or I think it's kind of interesting. But as Christine pointed out in her presentation, what can be a more sort of subtle way of looking at these results is using a sum of ranks analysis. And the idea of a sum of ranks analysis is that because we've got the ranking 1, 2, 3, 4, if psi is going on, then you wouldn't just expect more hits, but you might expect more second places than otherwise. And you might expect fewer third places and even fewer fourth places. So that's what sum of ranks can show you. So it's kind of a bit more subtle. It's not more subtle, it's more, don't know, can't think of the word, but it kind of maybe more, gosh, really? So here's the sum of ranks results. So you get actually, in terms of all the participants, it kind of comes a bit closer to significance, or it's at 0.18. The meat eaters, unsurprisingly, still not significant. Vegetarians and vegans now starts to come close to significance, to the significance level of 0.05. And actually, if you look at a visualization of those results, then it kind of is perhaps a bit clearer what's going on. So if you look at the meat eaters, they still had, by the way, more first and second places than third and fourth, but fewer firsts, and as you can see. But the vegetarians and vegans had quite a nice kind of step down from first, second, third, and fourth. Right, so all the other things that I looked at, so didn't really show any effect. So I didn't really find any effect from whole foods. I didn't find any effect from added sugars. I did find a potential effect, or it was close to significant for people who avoided alcohol. So they did better than people who drank alcohol. No particular effect from fasting. Now, this was a post hoc analysis. Some of my participants actually came to the experiment in a fasting state. I didn't ask them to or anything, but they just happened to be fasting for more than 5 hours. And so I thought it'd be interesting to look at those 5 participants and how they did. And it turned out that they did pretty well. Actually, their results came close to significance. They were either ranked 1 or 2. And if you look at the sum of ranks, that was actually my only significant result. But as I say, there was a lot of caution in this. This was a post hoc analysis. It wasn't in the pre-registration. But nevertheless, it shows something that might be worth looking at. In terms of the individual differences that it talked about, so belief in psi, creativity, personality, highly sensitive person, spare you looking at all the results. There are no significant differences there at all. I didn't find anything at all there. What might be going on? Well, it's despite finding no individual differences that were significant, it's still possible that there are correlates of psi, like psi belief or creativity, that may also correlate with diet. So that may be all that we're kind of measuring here. But it's also possible because both fasting, there is evidence to suggest that both fasting and vegetarianism can be good for your cognitive health. So perhaps if you're healthy, that way maybe you can manifest better psi, which is what a lot of my psi adept participants said. But what's also quite interesting is that I'm kind of assuming, or there's perhaps an implication that by fasting or going vegetarian or vegan, perhaps you're more psychic, but it's possible that it might be the other way round, or both. In other words, you might have a profound awakening experience, or you may be more susceptible to spirituality or psi, and therefore you go vegetarian or you start fasting. And actually, anecdotally, including at this conference, actually, people have approached me, particularly mediums, and said that this is the case, that once they became able to become a medium, then they couldn't eat meat anymore. So that's kind of quite interesting. So I think it's more or less final slide. So what are the limitations about this? Well, for a start, it was underpowered. So there's only 40, I say only 40 participants. It felt like a lot when I was doing them. But that only meant that I had 20 meat eaters and 20 vegetarians and vegans, which is perhaps why I wasn't really expecting to reach a level of significance. They would have had to perform really, really well for that to happen. The results haven't been corrected for multiple analyses. There is a possible experimenter effect. So in terms of that, so I mentioned all the ways that I introduced controls for blinding and so on, for the random number generating, for the judging. However, as the experimenter, I wasn't blind to people's diet. So perhaps I was nicer to the vegans and vegetarians than I was to the meat eaters, and that's maybe why they did better. Also, of course, there's always a possibility that there's some kind of psi effect going on as well. when I submitted this for this conference, one of the reviewers said, mention about the number of judges. So I'm mentioning about the number of judges. I just used one judge to judge the mentation. So it has been suggested that maybe 2 judges are better, or maybe even more judges are better. But kind of it becomes then a question of what do you do? How do you do that? Do you do an average of the judges' similarity scores, or do you analyse them separately? In which case, what if you get one set of results for one judge and one set of results for another? So, yes, I won't talk about that. I won't talk about that.
You can still talk if you want to eat into
no,
your question time.
No, I'm getting the message, Christine. So I will finish just with this slide, because this is important not to skip by. I would like to thank, obviously, my participants, without whom it just wouldn't have happened. I'd like to thank Julia Mossbridge, who I had a very useful conversation with her in Porto when choosing whether to use something like Ganzfeld or whether to use like a BEM replication. And she kind of said, no, don't use a BEM replication. It's nothing like what goes on in the real world with precognition. So, why do you expect something to show like that? So I'm quite glad I didn't do that. Thank Ewan and Phil, who helped me with each experiment, as I've already mentioned, Jim and Caroline, and of course my supervisors, Chris Rowe and Carol Cooper. And please do get in touch. Well, talk to me obviously here, but also feel free to connect either at my email address or my relatively new website. So thank you.
That was really interesting. Thank you, Mike. Can I be sneaky and have a chair's prerogative and ask a question? I'm just wondering if you asked your participants why they are adopting a meat-reduced or vegetarian or vegan diet, in terms of finding out why that might be affecting the SSE results.
I did ask them, actually, yeah, but I didn't analyse those at all.
Okay, so maybe we might hear something in the future? No.
Well, I mean, because there were only 20 participants as well, and I'd already looked at that in some detail with my SSE adepts, so asking them about why they were vegetarian and vegan, and and one thing I didn't mention about the theme, one of the themes that came up from that study was that a lot of them were, as well as believing that it helped with their SSE practice, a lot of them also were vegan, vegetarian for the kind of ethical reasons, cruelty to animals and so on. That was very important to them.
Yeah, I was just wondering about, what is it? Like, is it something else like empathy, maybe? Like, if you have this effect, like, is there something there with compassion?
Sorry,
yeah, thank you, sorry.
No, I mean, that's a good point. That's why I meant about the other correlates, that I might be sort of measuring something else instead of directly diet.
It's very interesting. Okay, questions, anybody? For Mike.
Am I right thinking your study is the first study of fasting and its effect on SSE?
Almost. There was a piece of doctoral research in the 1990s, which had looked at 12 people who had transitioned from eating meat to a vegan raw food diet. And it looked at detail of those sort of 12 people in terms of case studies, and they all mentioned about fasting. So that's the only other study that I know has looked at this in detail.
Well, this is quite significant, in a way amazing,
yeah.
because it's such a tradition for facilitating SSE that it's quite incredible that nobody has looked at this. So I hope you'll continue with just looking at fasting.
Oh, just looking at fasting. Yeah, well,
fasting and diet.
Yeah. Well, I hope to. I skipped over this slide, but I think it's going to be included in the multi-site BR Foundation collaboration between Etzel Cardenio and Helane and Chris and Christine actually as well. I believe on the basis of these results that will be in a much bigger Ganzfeld study, and also there's a possibility of doing a study just looking at 40 vegans, which obviously will be a much higher powered study than just 15, which is all I had in my study. So, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for a most inspiring lecture. I'm a lifelong vegetarian, so I appreciate it. I have a question, and that is it a long-term or short-term effect to be a vegetarian in this respect? One could think of an experiment where you take meat eaters and they eat vegetarian for a couple of days before, some of them, they eat vegetarian before doing the experiment, and the others do not. That could be interesting, because I noticed that while I was in school, I met a lot of comrades who said that before testing in school, they actually switched to vegetarianism because they got clearer in mind, they said.
Yes, so in my when I interviewed my adepts, my professional psychics, Ross Bartlett, who was a medium, he said that when he went vegan from being vegetarian, he noticed quite a dramatic improvement in his readings quite quickly. So that's one thing. But also in my survey of vegans and vegetarians, I think I'm right. Yes, the longer people who had been vegan, the sort of longer-term vegans reported more anomalous experiences than those who had just been vegan for a short time. So there was a positive correlation there for the length of time that they'd been vegan and how much anomalous experiences they'd reported. So that's kind of contradictory in a way, because someone's reporting a dramatic effect, but there also seems to be a cumulative effect as well. But I have to stress, and I possibly didn't stress this enough, as Adrian pointed out, this is the first real empirical research that's been done in this, so it's all exploratory really, and it's all preliminary. So it all needs to be replicated and confirmed to see whether there really is anything going on.
But thanks again, Mike. A round of applause.